Mysterious Ancient Mariners.
Part 14. Antony and Cleopatra. Antony was a soldier's soldier, rough, high-living, blustery, zestful, as much a splendid animal as a man. His bullish good looks were typically Roman, and he modeled himself on the swaggering comportment of Hercules, the Romans' name for the Greek demigod Heracles, whom he fancifully claimed as his ancestor. These qualities often offended the historian Plutarch, who often wrote of Antony's boastfulness. By the time his hour of confrontation with Octavian approached, Antony was in his 50s, and his powers were declining, sapped not only by wine and war, but also by the luxury-loving court of Cleopatra, whom he married in 37 BC. He came from the masculine ambiance of the Roman West. She belonged, heart and mind, to the Hellenistic East, a world old in subtlety, luxurious, ceremonial, shot through with a dark sophistication. Like the rest of the Ptolemies, she was not a native Egyptian but a Greek, and was the fruit of generations of inbreeding, for the Ptolemaic kings married within the family, occasionally even wedding their sisters. Highly intelligent and deeply ambitious, she schemed to gain from Rome all the traditional lands from her royal ancestors. Octavian was every bit her match in wiliness. In 32 BC, he appeared before the Roman Senate and read a document that he claimed was Mark Antony's will. It bequeathed to Cleopatra all of the Roman East. As Octavian had anticipated, the senators were outraged. They empowered him to strip Antony of his command and to declare war on Cleopatra. The showdown came only months later. In 31 BC, Antony and Cleopatra, with a fleet of 500 warships and 300 merchantmen, and an army of some 75,000 Roman legionnaires, 12,000 cavalrymen, and 25,000 light armored infantrymen, hovered on a front that stretched down the whole western shore of Greece. Octavian and his veteran general Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa concentrated their forces in the southern Italian ports of Brundisium and Tarentum, 400 ships and a tightly knit Roman army of about 80,000 foot soldiers and 20,000 cavalrymen. Although Octavian had seen naval action, he was never happy in war. He preferred the quieter ruthlessness of politics. But in entrusting his fortunes in battle to Agrippa, he had made a typically astute move. At the age of 32, this general was a man of huge military talents and unfaltering loyalty. Agrippa seemed the paragon of his age, abstemious in his habits, widely cultivated, and morally irreproachable. Even the gossiping Roman annalists could leave no stain on him, and he demonstrated his brilliance from the start. While Antony and Cleopatra, surrounded by their vast fleet, lay in wait at the Greek port of Patras, near the entrance to the Gulf of Corinth, Agrippa outflanked them. Despite the unpredictable weather of an early March of 31 BC, he crossed the sea by an unfrequented route and fell upon Antony's base at Methone, on the southwest tip of Greece. This powerful outpost was taken by surprise and captured, and from there Agrippa began to harass the grain ships that were bringing up supplies to Antony from Egypt. It was an inspired opening move, and one that could cost Antony dearly. Next, Agrippa raided Antony's bases to the north, and so diverted attention from his real thrust, the transport of Octavian's troops across the sea from Italy. This was accomplished with speed and secrecy, and by the end of March, the invading fleet and army lay only 30 miles to the north of Antony's headquarters in the Ambracian Gulf. Octavian, arriving to join the battle, now waited. The great sheltered gulf was all but impregnable by sea, for its mouth was closed by straits less than half a mile wide. And on either side of the narrows, Antony's men had constructed forts whose giant catapults could deluge passing ships with stones and fire. But in fortifying himself, Antony had also trapped himself, and Cleopatra as well. Antony and Cleopatra, hurrying to the Ambracian Gulf from Patras, found their navies split. Many of their ships were trapped inside the Gulf, and the rest were scattered in the harbors along the coast. Meanwhile, Agrippa detached some of Octavian's fleet to mop up these isolated squadrons. One by one, Antony's other bases, including Patras, lost their protective ships and were occupied by Octavian's troops. While the enemy waited confidently outside the Gulf, summer began to take its toll on Antony's men. Disease, probably malaria and dysentery, spread through the tents, especially in the encampment of the southern point on the constricted and unhealthy headland of Actium. Deaths led to desertion. To replace those lost, Antony had to send soldiers in to kidnap farmers and vagrants. Supplies ran critically low. A few blockade runners slipped through the enemy squad, but not enough to feed Antony's increasingly restive and mutinous men. Even many of his officers began deserting to join Octavian forces, some because they were convinced their cause was lost, others because they heartily disliked Cleopatra. On a misty morning in early August, Antony's fleet made a sudden move to break out. Admiral Gaius Sosius, one of his most trusted and experienced supporters, pushed through the straits in swirling fog and routed a blockading squadron. One moment it seemed as if the situation was saved. The next, Agrippa had sailed up with the rest of the fleet and had pushed Sosius back. The waiting game resumed. Through the month of August, Antony's fleet lay at its moorings, and its soldiers fretted with inaction. By the end of August, his fleet and army had been under siege for 4 months. Antony summoned his generals and admirals to the southern promontory of Actium and called a war council. He had only 2 choices left. He could abandon his fleet and march eastward into Greece, or he could embark with a group of his soldiers and attempt to break out, leaving the rest of his army to fend for itself. Lucius Canidius Crassus, his land commander, argued for withdrawing into Greece and for deciding the issue in battle there. An action by sea would divide and fritter the army's strength, he pointed out. All of Antony's past successes had been won on land. Emphasizing the difficulties of an overland retreat through the mountains, Cleopatra, on the other hand, argued for a forceful naval action, even if they would be cut off from Egypt by Octavian's galleys. Moreover, Cleopatra could not leave her fleet behind. In the hold of her flagship was most of Egypt's treasure. Antony acceded to her case. He realized that without a fleet, his army would be all but cut off by the enemy from escape farther east. But if a good portion of the troops and the navy could be extricated from the snare at Actium, then Antony might fall back on the rich and populous provinces of Cyrenaica and Syria, where he still had 7 legions, and gather his strength for another day. So, whether because of strategy or love, Antony and Cleopatra decided to face their fate together rather than separately. The circling shores of Ambracia, once a haven, now a trap, had thinned out Antony's soldiers and his oarmen, but evidently not his infatuation. The forces that faced each other were unequal. Antony's remnant of soldiers and oarsmen was insufficient to man his whole fleet, so he burned the smaller warships and many merchantmen. Of the 230 vessels left, most were larger than those of Octavian, high-built galleys that ranged from ordinary triremes up to monstrous tenors. At the waterline, their flanks were girded with massive iron-bound timbers as protection against ramming, and the heavy towers fore and aft were filled by Antony with archers and slingers. He divided the fleet into 4 squadrons. Cleopatra's force was a flotilla of 60, including some merchantmen. The other 3 squadrons carried the bulk of the fighting men embarked from the camps overlooking the bay. They included 20,000 selected legionnaires and 2,000 archers, all battle-tested veterans. But they were used to following Antony on land. Plutarch described one grizzled officer, his body covered with battle scars, calling out to Antony in disgust as he was being embarked. "Imperator, why do you distrust these wounds and this sword and put your hopes in these miserable logs of wood? Let Egyptians and Phoenicians do their fighting in sea, but give us the land on which we are accustomed to stand, and either conquer our enemies or die." To this, Plutarch added, Antony made no reply. Against these juggernauts, poised to bludgeon their way to freedom, Octavian opposed 400 war galleys. Lighter and lower than those of the enemy, but equipped like them with turrets and reinforcing belts of timbers, they ranged inside from biremes to sixers. Among them were several examples of the Liburnian, a light, fast, 2-banked galley adapted from the vessels of the Liburnians, pirates of the Adriatic. On these ships, Octavian embarked 8.5 legions, some 40,000 men, almost twice the force of Antony. They were Italian legionnaires, loyal and finely disciplined. Their ships were equipped less for ramming than for boarding, and they carried an added weapon, perfected by Agrippa. This was a heavy grapnel fired at long range from a catapult on the deck. Once it had fallen across an enemy bulwark, it was harder to hack away than a conventional grappling device, for its head consisted of sharp steel pole that embedded itself in the deck like an iron spike of the Raven. Octavian's ships, though perhaps not faster than Antony's, were more maneuverable. Their decks were stripped for action, and as was customary in battle, they were driven only by oarsmen. Antony's ships revealingly carried their sails stacked on deck, portending flight. On August 29th, as Antony's fleet was preparing to move out, a storm swept along the coast. For 4 days, mountainous seas pounded the shore and roared through the gulf's narrow passage. Agrippa took his fleet behind a headland to ride it out, and Antony's ships rocked gently inside the protected bay. Ashore, 50,000 soldiers huddled in their billowing tents. Antony had left them under the command of Canidius Crassus, with instructions to march inland and make for Asia Minor overland as soon as the fleet had escaped. Encamped on their storm-racked strand beside the skeletons of burned-out ships, they must have known they were being sacrificed. The storm faded, and the morning of September 2nd dawned clear. Beyond the harbor mouth, where the seas spread in a sparkling plain of blue, Octavian's galleys were already mustering. Octavian had gone ashore to wait out the storm, knowing that the seas had been running too high for Antony to venture out. On this morning of the battle, he left his tent before sunrise to review the fleet. According to the historian Dio Cassius, the general addressed his embarking soldiers, pouring scorn on the enemies. Alexandrians and Egyptians who worship reptiles as beasts and gods, who embalm their own bodies to give them semblance of immortality, who are most reckless in effrontery but most feeble in courage, and who, worst of all, are slaves to a woman and not to a man. Antony, meanwhile, was aware that 3 months on hard rations had wasted his men's body and soul. So he sought to steel them and reassure them by stressing the might of their ships. Now, in the translucent dawn, the vessels of Antony and Cleopatra came filing through the straits of the Ambracian Gulf into the open sea. On the mainland camps of both Octavian and Antony, stripped of their best fighting men, watched the scene without moving against each other. Antony's 4 squadrons crossed the shallow harbor bar and spread out in 2 ranks on a front 1.5 miles long. Then, with its wings still protected from Octavian's greater numbers by the retreating headlands to either side, Antony's fleet came to a halt. In the right-hand squadron sailed Antony and his second admiral, Gellius Publicola. With the left went Gaius Sosius, and behind the center hovered Cleopatra's squadron of 60 vessels, ready to seize a chance of flight through the heart of the opposing lines. The queen herself was carried by her flagship Antonius, on which she kept a hoard of gold, silver coins, and bars and jewels. Antony's strategy was to take his stand at the entrance of the Gulf and to make Octavian's fleet come to him, so the 2 fleets watched each other until noon, with a mile of calm sea between them. At their benches under the deck, stifling in the September heat, the rowers leaned apprehensively on their oars. When he saw that the enemy was not going to advance, Antony tried one last gamble. It depended on a local phenomenon of which he was aware, and perhaps the men of Rome were not. Usually in this part of Greece, a breezing sprang up from the west at midday, veered into the northwest, and freshened into a healthy wind. With such a wind, if it was strong enough, Antony could loose his sails and outrun Agrippa's oarsmen, and save most of his fleet not by battle, but by flight. Indeed, Plutarch reported shortly, a wind was rising from the sea, whipping the surface into small whitecaps. It first came from the west, almost head-on, so Antony could not yet raise his sails. He would have to depend upon his oarsmen to gain the sea room necessary to round the headland to the south. And now he gave his signal to advance. His admiral Sosius, on the left wing and farther south, led the way. Octavian, on the flank facing Sosius, backed water to lure him farther out. Agrippa, facing Antony and Publicola, immediately extended his line to envelop Antony's wing. Both protagonists were now maneuvering for sea room, Antony to escape and Agrippa and Octavian to outflank him by covering his fleet in a wide crescent. But Octavian's fleet did not retreat far enough west for Antony's purposes. To clear the cape south of him, he needed even more sea room, and the wind still held from the west. He could not avoid direct combat. So he sent his forward lines against the enemy. A storm of stones and flaming missiles whirred from the ship's catapults on either side. Lodged high in their wooden turrets, the stone-throwing engines of Antony's hefty ships were especially formidable. They filled the air and spattered the sea and ships with a variety of projectiles, boulders, giant arrows, flaming hemp. These heavy ships, thrusting forward, at last reached the enemy. Crammed with their soldiers and engines of war, their cumbersome sails still stowed on decks, and their sides heavy with reinforced wood, they pushed sluggishly into the opposing fleet. Each of Antony's warships was assailed by 2 or 3 opponents charging from different angles. Agrippa's galleys, more maneuverable, wove in and out, ramming and retiring, then returning to ram again, or speeding in close and shattering banks of oars. Antony's monsters attempted to grapple and hold them, or to overwhelm them with catapult fire. Sometimes, when ships became locked together, Antony's veterans swept the opposing decks or showered them with stones from above. In their turrets, the slingers and the archers poured a terrible fire on the legionnaires, locked in hand-to-hand combat below it. At other times, Agrippa's swift ramming tactics sank the enemy for all their massive belts of timber. But Plutarch writes that often Agrippa's galleys did not dare to engage Antony's head-on because of their colossal prows and rams. So the fight eventually stagnated into clusters of ships locked together. Antony's men defending, while Agrippa's warriors hacked at the tower-like hulks of the enemy's ships with pikes and firebrands. It was inevitable that Antony's smaller fleet should eventually be surrounded, and he must have known this. Pushing ever west and north, they also increased their chance on making good in their flight. Soon they had broken with their center altogether. A gap opened and slowly widened. Finally, sometime between 2 and 3 in the afternoon, the refreshing wind veered into the north, and Cleopatra made her move. Her flagship Antonius was seen to shake out its great purple sails and lurch forward. With her squadron of 60 galleys and merchantmen following her, Cleopatra sailed swiftly through the center gap. The Antonius reached the open ocean and turned south for Egypt. Not only the queen's own galleys, but many of those in the battle, as she could break free, turned to follow her, hoisting their sails and toppling their catapults, grapnels, and even some of their fortified turrets into the sea to lighten the ships and hasten their speed. But among those that was too tightly locked in combat to join the flight was Antony's flagship. Calling for a fast quinquereme, however, he hastened after Cleopatra. He was swayed by the sentiments neither of a commander nor a brave man, Plutarch lamented. He forgot everything else, betrayed, and ran away from those who were fighting and dying in his cause, and hastened after the woman who had already ruined him and would make his ruin still more complete. Antony's captains were surrounded by the mass of Agrippa's galleys, and a few were able to follow their commander. Antony's quinquereme caught up with Cleopatra, and she signaled him to come aboard, but he could not face her. Instead, wrote Plutarch, he went forward alone to the prow and sat down by himself in silence, holding his head in both his hands. Agrippa's heavier-oared ships, without their sails aboard, could not overtake Antony, but several swift Liburnians took up the chase. As they came up with the Antonius, Antony took command of the flagship and turned her to face them. All of the Liburnians shied away from the powerful flagship except one, commanded by a Spartan named Eurycles. Years earlier, Antony had beheaded Eurycles' father for robbery, and the Spartan now shook his lance at Antony from his deck. Antony shouted at him from the poop of the Antonius, "Who is this that pursues Antony?" "I am Eurycles, the son of Lycaris," the man shouted back, "whom the fortune of Caesar enables to avenge the death of his father." Eurycles sent his galley plunging at the Antonius, but the flagship's well-trained oarsmen swept her out of the attacker's path, and Eurycles' vessel smashed into another ship, spinning her around. Bouncing off this galley, he came alongside another and grappled with it. This one turned out to contain some of Antony's plates and furniture, which Eurycles seized. In the meantime, the Antonius escaped. To the north, Antony's fleet was gradually being worn down, hopelessly outnumbered, abandoned by their leader. Many captains and crews surrendered. Others fled or were blown back into the Gulf, where they faced another blockade until they too capitulated. But still others, wrote Dio Cassius, battled on into the dusk. Many of these were probably the great Sixers, Seveners, and Eighters, beloved of the eastern Mediterranean fleets. Floating castles, they resisted all attack, until Agrippa decided to resort to the ultimate weapon of fire. Flaming projectiles were catapulted onto the big ship's decks, along with pots of coal and burning pitch. Aboard other galleys, the legionnaires threw javelins with torches on their tips. At first, the defenders doused the fire with their drinking water, then with seawater hauled up in buckets. But the wind-fanned flames spread across the wooden decks and ignited the rowing benches. Desperately, the men tried to smother them with their heavy cloaks, and even with corpses. Dio Cassius wrote, "But later, especially when the wind raged furiously, the flames flared up more than ever, fed by this very fuel. So long as only a part of the ship was on fire, men would stand by that part and leap into it, hewing away or scattering the timbers, and these detached timbers were hurled by some into the sea and others against their opponents." Some galleys moved to grapple with Agrippa's ships, in the hope of burning them or boarding and saving themselves. But the enemy stood off. Soon the great galleys had become giant infernos. Many of the sailors were suffocated by the smoke, while the oarsmen perished in the roaring flames. Soldiers tried to strip off their armor and were pierced by arrows from Agrippa's galleys. Others were roasted to death, or threw themselves into the sea and drowned trying to swim to shore. Others committed suicide. By night time, the battle was over, and only a few charred hulks glimmered fitfully on the heaving sea. Some 130 of Antony's ships had fallen into Agrippa's hands, and 30 or 40 more were sunk. The casualties among Antony's troops probably numbered little more than 5,000, for the size of their ships had saved many of them until the point of surrender. The casualties among the crews are unknown, but they were far greater. Of Agrippa's losses, the historians are silent. Certainly, however, they were less than Antony's.